fine. So, but I mean, a little bit, let's go back to where we came from, because a lot of the things I do, it sounds super serious. And a lot of it is kind of serious, but at the same time, I really like having fun, and I really want to have fun with what I'm doing. And I'm very much, I try and do things that are motivated by my curiosity and something that I find exciting, and then hopefully that will translate in the output, whatever the output is. With hybrids, it was a little bit like sometimes putting out an art project or a whole project that you spent quite a few years on, it can feel quite serious in a way that I'm not super comfortable with, like artist statements and all of that. It can feel like I find the art world a little bit sort of stiff sometimes. So instead of having a foreword, I asked David Strictly for some drawings, some introductory drawings, because I thought that could kind of set the tone. And when you open the book, it's kind of like, okay, this is a bit of fun, but it's also art and it's kind of serious at the same time. And with the cover, we couldn't work out one cover shot, and I didn't want to choose a cover. So we put all the images on, but stretched them. So actually, if you look at a book from an angle, you can kind of see all of them. So if we talk about kind of what I do, and you mentioned it a little bit, it's quite difficult for me to say. I have more hair than hats, so I have more hats than hair. It's a difficult one. I mean, I do photography, and I've been doing that ever since I really picked up a camera when I was like 14. And then I direct and write. So that's in the film world. So I write my own work. The writing part is quite important, I think, in the sense that for me, the process often starts with the word. It starts with verbalizing something, going around it, figuring out what I'm trying to do, and then afterwards visualizing it. That's kind of my process. I'm also an explorer, which is a word that I think I don't want to take it lightly, because a lot of people say they explore and then they kind of go for a trek on a foothill of a mountain where 6 million other people have been that year. It can be a joyful, but it's not exploration. Exploration is really, for me, going places where nobody else has been before, or very few, to come back ideally with some new findings. So we will come back into this when we go to Project Pressure, but it's part of what I do, and part of that curiosity that I have. So I trek up mountains, I cave dive, and go to unexplored cave systems, a lot of the time in Mexico. I also happen to sometimes stand in front of a camera and talk about what I do, like for CNN and so on and so on. And I also curate, meaning that I don't just produce my own art, but I also work with other artists and put together other works and form a coherent narrative. With all of this, I am insanely naive and overly optimistic. So I often start projects thinking that, yeah, okay, that will be okay, and that can't be that complicated. And then years later, I'm like, oh my God, never something that complicated again. And then I start on something even more complicated. Anyway, the point is that when I started working with climate change, I was speaking to a lot of scientists, and I thought it would be quite a good idea for me to maybe have a science degree. So I have a BSc in environmental science. We are here to talk about the work at the gallery, and the work at the gallery is very specific to an organization I founded. So if I go back and look at the core of what I do, in my practice, it's about mapping. Hybrids, as you mentioned, Malcolm, that hybrids for me really was about mapping hybrid culture, social anomalies that were happening on the fringes of society. And the internet kind of transformed that, because it became easier to connect the dots and for people to connect. So it was about that. And all the other projects I do have some mapping component. It can be in a very physical sense, where we map underground cave systems, I am mapping a big part of the seafloor in Denmark at the moment, and also looking at climate change as a global issue has a mapping component as well, where we communicate around glaciers. So we mentioned Project Pressure. So Project Pressure is an organization I set up, founded in 2008, and we set up to visualize climate change, and we use art as a positive touch point. And all of this sounds a little bit, it's so boring to talk about, so I'll try and do it a little bit more entertaining, but it is important, because most things about climate change is utterly depressing and you just want to turn off and go bye. But that's not really an option, because it's happening and we need to deal with it. So if we can have something that can stimulate people and get them to engage with it, it might actually follow through with some change. I am acutely aware that we don't need more awareness. Creating art about climate change that is purely awareness is past its due date. We don't need more awareness. We don't need awareness about plastic in the seas. We don't need awareness about climate change or most of the other environmental matters, because we do know what's happening. We just need to act on it. And I'm saying we just need to act on it, but that's what we really need to do. So anyway, so how do we do this? So Project Pressure is a combination of art, science, and education. We use art as a positive touch point, and then we try and communicate science, and then we try and educate people. If we look at what's been happening around climate change, it's fair to say that science has failed in communicating. So when I started on this project, I was like, well, how can we do something around climate change that can work in a way where it's interesting, but it's also a clean cut that you can't attack it. Remind yourself that in 2008, the people that we now call climate deniers, we call climate skeptics. It's like saying, yeah, gravity. Oh, did that pen just drop? No, it didn't, because I don't believe in gravity. That's not really an option. And you can't really not believe in climate change. It's not something you believe in, it's science. However, to create a project that was bulletproof, that could not be attacked for not being accurate, we chose to communicate around glaciers. So why glaciers? Well, they're important. A lot of fresh water is stored in glaciers, and it covers a great amount of the planet. So they store about 75% of fresh water, and more than 1 billion people rely on this as a freshwater source. And most importantly, they are receding at alarming rates. So I think in the text, and I think that was something I hadn't really phrased it that way before, but we always said that they're key indicators. Malcolm put that they are like a barometer for climate change. It's really simple. Glaciers only react to long-term warming trends. So they will melt if it gets warmer, but not just because it's one hot summer day. It will be a hot summer and hot summers. So they are indicators of what climate change look like. This is something that we could then use. Okay, how do we use this? Well, we can use the art part. So if we look at at art as in some of the classical art forms, the landscape has always been present. It's one of the archetypes of when you're creating art. So in that sense, it made sense to maybe start working with that. So that's what we've been doing. So I want to go back a little bit before I get to the artwork themselves, so you can get an idea of the process behind. Because when you look at an image, it might look like, okay, this is really simple, I get it, or maybe you don't get it. But anyway, there's a lot of information captured in one image. So how do you measure glaciers? Well, you can really measure them 3 ways, and this is essentially measuring climate change. So satellite images, zip, that's what satellite says when they take pictures. Zip, you look at things from above, and then you can see the surrounding area, if it's shrunk or if it's expanded. They shrink. but satellite images only go back so far. And in some areas, they don't even exist. Direct measurements is really a scientist going onto a glacier, putting a stick in the ice, seeing the snow arrive, and then the snow melt, and doing that on a quite a few places on a glacier, and then calculating what the mass balance change is. It's laborious, and it sounds laborious. And next, there's another way of doing it, and that is using comparative images. What's great about the photo, or I say images because it could also be paintings, is that even kind of like historic images that go way back can tell us something about present day climate. And this was the starting point for when I started the journey with Project Pressure, that we thought, well, we have to start communicating and visualizing climate change. So if we can take the images, if we can create something that starts with comparative images and show the change, then we can visualize climate change. So some of the places I've been to is there's this place here. I'm pointing at the screen and you can't see where I'm pointing, but if you look at the image on the left with the man standing in the blue anorak, in the background there's a mountain, and that has a glacier that is called the Y, as in the letter Y glacier. It looks like a Y, and is not that the image there is by Robin Church, who went on an expedition to the Rwenzori Mountains in 1968. I went back in 2012, and that is some of the images that are in one of the images that's in the show in Street Level Photo Works and in Glasgow. And it was interesting to me because the mapping part is interesting here, because they're not really mapped, the Rwenzori glaciers. There's a lot of imagery around some of the European glaciers and other places that are accessible, but the mountains of Rwenzori, nobody's really been there for a very long time. And it's bordering Congo DRC, so it is and definitely was a conflict zone. So it was prohibited, you know, it was difficult. Well, you'd risk your life it was bad to go there, so people didn't. And then I launched an expedition to see what was left and came back with the findings. So that was one of the things I did. And I thought it was a very, very moving thing, actually. It was very moving for me to go to the mountains, having done extensive research, sourced comparative images from way back. I had to source maps from that would maybe have some trekking routes that I could do that I could then try and retrace. I found a map in Congo was called Zaire, and I thought, okay, what is this? And so when we do all this, it gets a little bit technical. It's not easy. So we had to take an analog paper map and input that and get the coordinates right on the GPS. So I could follow what used to be a path, you know, somewhat maybe 60 years earlier, and to try and get into Congo DRC to see what was left on the glaciers on that side. And when I did that, I followed this GPS and I thought it better work, but I knew I had to pass a very wide river at some point. So I packed everything in, you can back there somewhere, in like waterproof rucksacks. So if we needed to go, I would just like, well, we have to swim across. It will be ice cold, but we swim across with a rope, of course, and then we follow the trail, see what's there. And so when I got to the river, there was these grass, small islands that were growing across it. So I could just bounce around it. It must have, if you looked at it from the side, it would have looked like Mario Brothers or something, like bing, 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 across the river. And at that point, I was like, okay, this really crazy plan might actually work. And it did. And I came back with some amazing images that I was very, very happy about. And it really did a lot to put equatorial glaciers on the map. The expedition has been featured everywhere from National Geographic to BBC to many places, and it was important because this is 10 years ago, and as I said, it was an interesting part to do. This is from Greenland, and what's interesting about this shot is that it is an image to the left from 1933. If we look at mapping historically, or still now actually, what is being mapped is often being dictated by the military, if there's or commercial. So a lot of seafloor have been mapped because there's oil, there's resources. Some of the continents and some of the land has been mapped because it might have a strategic importance. So Greenland, before the Second World War, was not really mapped. So both Denmark and Norway started flying reconnaissance around the coast to see where could you put a base, where could you put maybe a landing strip, and so on and so on. Accidentally, they also happened to photograph a lot of the glaciers, and I can't remember the statistics, but it's enormous, the amount of ice that flows into the ocean from Greenland. Greenland now is the single largest source of sea level rise, more than anything else. It's impossible to fathom the scales. So these shots, these images, they were, I work with scientists in Denmark, and they've been located some glass plate negs in some asbestos-filled storage facility in Denmark. And when they got out, they were processed and prints were made, and they also and then we retraced where the locations, and then I launched an expedition to go back and kind of do comparative aerial photography. And then it's the image you've seen in the show maybe, or that you recognize here. And when you look at this, the scale is difficult to understand. I think the width of the glacier to the right is something like 6 kilometers, and the glacier front is about 70 meters high. But really, what this picture says a lot also is, if you look at the mountain, there's a rim, there's a ridge that has a different color, and that is the amount of ice, glacier ice, that has dropped off. Now, as I say, it's difficult to understand the scales, but this is how we try to communicate around this. This glacier also does a similar job in communicating the same way, in that you can see the moraine at the front, you can see how big it used to be. It's the Findel Glacier in Switzerland, and it's important because from a mapping perspective, they have some of the oldest records going back. The Swiss, the World Glacier Monitoring Service that we collaborate with is based in Switzerland, so they gather all the world's data. This is a shot from the Rwenzori Mountains in Uganda, and I am looking onto a top called Mount Speke, and you can just about see how the glacier used to come all the way down to where there's further down the mountain. I have a comparative image from, I think, 1900 something, where the glacier came all the way down. And ice basically exists on the planet at latitudes, you know, if you go north and south, or if you go up. So if you go to towards the North Pole or the South Pole, it gets colder, but also if you go up, so if you go up the mountains, it gets cold. So around the equator, the only reason there's ice if you get high. So here, the mountains are about 5,000 meters above sea level, or just under. with warming, the ice, there's no more mountains, so it will, the freezing point will just go up the mountain until there's no more ice left, and it's a sad situation. There's a sense of loss for me when I look at this, because for me, glaciers are a little bit like the dinosaurs of the modern era. They will become extinct in the equatorial glaciers will become extinct. And when you're standing in front of such a big chunk of mountain, you really understand, even though it's very humbling as a human, you also understand the power and the impact that we're having, and it's quite frightening. So translating those emotions into photography is very difficult, I think, and I'm not sure it really works to that extent, but I hope that people react to the images regardless. The next shot here is from Nepal, and that is unnamed. It's a glacier that still does not have a name. And as we go through the images here, I don't know if you noticed, but you'll probably find out that there's one from each of the world's populated continents. We have, this is from Bolivia, near La Paz, and it's to also show the connectivity that we have with these ice bodies. There's a lot of people relying on the water runoff, and it's important because with ice, when it snows and it lands on the ice, it accumulates the snow, and then in the melt period, it will melt, and it will not just be it will be a constant throughout the dry seasons. So glaciers kind of even out the ebbs and flows. But if we don't have that, there'll be maybe too much water that will result in flooding, and too little that will result in drought, and neither of which are good. The next shot here is really also, you can see how drastically this has disappeared. This is the Fox Glacier in New Zealand, and it's one of only 2 glaciers that connect with rainforest, not tropical rainforest, but rainforest. And it's an amazing sight, actually, to see all the green coming down and so on. One reminder around, one thing that I keep reminding myself when you look at these landscapes is that they're not static. Everything is related to time, and as such, time become a storytelling mechanism, because it's the time in between. It's the time of what has happened that is stored in the image. You can see the recession of the glacier in the shot, and I use time as an interval. I use that as a tool for storytelling. So you can see that in this image as well. And what is frightening around climate change is that the changes we're seeing are happening in years and decades, when the impacts are something relating to geological time. This shot here illustrates it really well. It's from a glacier tunnel in Sweden, up near Kebnekaise, and the tunnel only opened up for a few years, and then it wasn't there again. So these are the shots that are in the show, and I will leave it here, and then you can ask any questions if you want, and I can follow up afterwards. I want to talk a little bit about project pressure. So project pressure, when we look at climate change, it's really about how can we combine our resources and then together come up with some solutions. And being a white male, if I come up with a project about exploring and it just becomes another male with an icy beard on a mountain, whereas it should be about the subject of climate change. So there was a desire for me to do a collaborative project. So I started putting together a bunch of artists, some of them that I admired and some of them that I knew, etc., to come back with how can we actually create something that will give more of a balanced view, different inroads into the same subject. Because if you have different inroads, different artists' views on the same subject, i.e. Climate change, it will become about the subject rather than the single person. We tried to cover all continents and as many countries as we could. One of the first projects I commissioned was to work with Simon Norfolk. And Simon has been dealing in conflict zones and does that a lot. And he wanted to do something with fire. And after a lot of trial and error and like long conversations, I was like, well, we could do it with, if you do the glacier outlines, drawing that fire. So he developed a way to burn and create that line. And there was a lot of logistics and planning into this, which I, of course, and the team for Project Pressure helped with. So Simon, we worked with a lot. Another thing we did was to look at things on a microscopic level. So what are the microbes and mycological organisms that you can find in glaciers? Because it's not just a big thing. There's also things growing there and living there. And this happened as an open call. So we put out an open call and anyone could apply. And we had about 500 applications. And Christopher Parson won the challenge, and we provided him with an all full paid trip and gear to go to Nepal to create his project. Some of the scales are just impossible, and to grasp it, you kind of need to go to satellite. So Michael Benson deals with satellite images. Edward Bratinsky also uses aerial photography, and his work communicates around water runoff and how it's the glaciers are part of the hydraulic system. Naomi Goodall is a fantastic French artist who created a very elaborate project where you can kind of see the glacier degrading in front of itself. And Adam Hinson created a fantastic film in India where we spoke to farmers about first-hand impact on what was happening. Richard Moss, you might know his work from where he shot an infrared film in Congo, and he used the last in a glacier cave in Iceland. And then we have a project I did collaboratively with Simon, where we're a little bit further from just comparative images because things have moved on. We will be dealing with adaptation because it's not possible to just avoid climate change anymore. It will happen, and it will be finance driving things that will be saved. Let's say Bangladesh will probably get flooded because there's no financial incentive to save that part of the planet or that town, city. Whereas let's say New York, London, there will be floodgates. It won't happen. And to kind of illustrate that it's called adaptation, we went to Switzerland where there's the Rhone Glacier being covered in this thermal fabric, and we photographed that with a balloon with flashes on to kind of create this ray of light. So it looked like Renaissance paintings. I had worked with a balloon system on a commercial project for Levi's, so I suggested to Simon that we could maybe fly a helium balloon and get the flashes up in the air that way so we could light the landscape. So we did that. There's another project here, and now it's time to actually play a film. This illustrates really well what can be done and sort of what we do sometimes, because, well, the film kind of speaks for itself somehow, but we sourced aerial photography dating back to 1946 and then used that to reconstruct photogrammetry. We created photogrammetry, but we created that from different years. And then we created an animation to tell the story of what's happening to Sweden's highest point that is shifting. So I think it's a beautiful film, and it kind of shows how to communicate science in a way that maybe makes it a little bit sexier somehow. So when I work on these kind of projects, I of course work with teams because it's always good to know that there's a lot of other people that are much better than most things than you will ever be. So it's about getting together with those guys and creating something together. For me, a lot of my projects are really a collaborative process, and it wouldn't happen without people I collaborate with. Yet at the same time, also they probably wouldn't happen without my my drive and input sometimes. A lot of my work, a lot of this work that we created and others is, as Malcolm said, it's together in this exhibition called Meltdown. It's currently on show in Ljubljana, and we also have a show that opens in a few weeks in New Zealand. And it sounds exotic and stuff, but what we did, we actually, it's not the best to do, but it's the best we can do. So each expedition has been carbon offset. The entire production of the artworks has been offset. And in New Zealand, we're actually sailing the show from the North Island to the South Island. It's been produced locally. Some of the other things we've done is like single pop-up art interventions. So when we did the Voices for the Future, I put the words of 6 youth activists on the UN building in New York, including Greta Thunberg. So I guess it's a little bit, where are we now? Because some of the things I've been debating recently, and I kind of just want to put it out there, and then you can take it or leave it. But it's been about stories that focus on individual action, and it's a little bit like fossil fuels can kind of divert the responsibility. So what's really happening if we looking at the history of climate change is, first there was denying and then discrediting science, which is kind of like, okay, we're over that now, we're not doing that anymore. And then I think a stage 2, where there was a deliberate tactic, is yet to be seen, but for sure a lot of the fossil fuels company were very happy about creating a narrative that was around individual focus and individual responsibility. So people would start bickering about, are you eating meat, or are you, what kind of petrol do you put in house your energy in? And so it would become an individual choice issue rather than a systemic issue. And really what climate change is, that we need to keep the focus on the fact that it requires systemic change. The systems are failing. And so, yes, we can do things as an individual, and we should do them, but really what we need to do is to demand systemic change. And I want to talk a little bit about net zero, because it sounds all great, kind of this kind of net zero, but what is it really? Net zero is not true zero. Net zero is like vast amounts of CO2 being offset at some point. So net zero in the future, it's a wreck. It doesn't work. It's basically the idea that we can just keep doing what we're doing, and then at some point we will have some alien technology or something that will then come and all of a sudden rescue this. And there are readily available technological solutions to what we need to do. We just need to deploy them at scale. So that's really what we need to do. And I think I just want to say delaying so far has been catastrophic. I was quite naive. I thought maybe when I started Project Press in 2008, by 2012, we could have a show, we could do this, and we could see change. And the CO2 emissions just keep rising every year. They might have had a little blimp because of COVID, but nothing that actually matters at all. And it's hugely depressing, but at the same time, my hope for optimism at the moment now is that what has changed is that we're not discussing if we should change, we're discussing when and how. And if you think of that to have come from outright denying, no, let's not do anything, to yes, we need to change. Okay, some people just don't really want to change, so that it's actually a huge step. So with that, I will say thank you very much, and take some questions if there are any.
Thank you very much, Klaus. That was very interesting indeed. You kind of blown my mind. Do you want to stop sharing your screen now? Yeah, thank you. There are a couple of questions in, but before we go to them, just picking up on you know, the whole way that you do work in terms of blending the rather anodyne approach of science, depending on where you stand, combining that with the kind of creativity of artistic photography, and to create photographs that actually are quite aesthetically pleasing to look at, whilst being very practically usable, i.e., as you've ended this now, it's a call to action. So it's a kind of part of a whole portfolio of approaches that you do indeed have. And it relates to some degree to one of the questions here. Let me see. Right, you shared an image of the Rhone glaciers covered in the fabric. And interestingly enough, Christian Hoog gave a talk last week on his work, which focuses in on that in actual fact. But Paul Curry, who's a very regular attendee at our talks, thank you, Paul. Based on your direct experience of glacial decline across the globe, have you any hope at all that the remaining glaciers can be protected or their loss reversed?
No, there's too much inbuilt carbon in the atmosphere for things to get better anytime very soon.
Yeah.
We did a poster campaign actually, like getting interesting facts that we put on top of images. And one of the things is that, I don't know if you heard of ppm, which is particle per million. It's how much CO2 is in the atmosphere. And last time there was what we have now, there were palm trees growing on the edge of Antarctica. It's when we scream panic, and it's like, okay, it's panic because it will be really, 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 really bad, but not now, but soon. That's the problem with climate change. So, and I don't think people just don't comprehend the timescales, and that you know, we should have panicked 10 years ago, and it's difficult to it's very difficult to get up to speed with this. But no, unfortunately, for a lot of things, there aren't no hope in keeping status quo or having the world that we knew it. But if we act with enough, if we do enough, then for sure, you know, the worst can be avoided. And I think that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very good to see those issues, or that articulation around about net zero presented in the way that you've done that in one slide. And I think that's something that has to be shared, because there is a lot of denial around about it. I mean, Forever Changes commenced at the beginning of COP26, and as we kind of anticipated, lots of discussion happened generally in the media around about COP26. And of course, once it's all done, it's like, okay, we've ticked that box now, you know. But to go back to another question here, the image that you presented, the dual image, there was the one from Greenland and the image from whenever it was, 50 years ago, maybe something like that.
Either one was from 1933.
Oh, 33, right, even longer. But Stirling Photography Festival asks, here your images are almost 80 years apart. If we look to document changes in our environment today, what time span might show changes?
This is interesting because when I started mapping, this is really, really interesting question. I'm very happy about this actually, because when I started doing this, I thought, okay, let's look at things in a time span that we have to source historic images and so on and so on. But as a matter of fact, I have started going back to some of the places I visited 10 years ago. And the changes are dramatic and drastic. And I think there's a whole body of work that might come out of this, because I'm going back to several places to see what is happening. And it's very drastic changes. And I was in Iceland actually at the end of last year, and I came up to a place that I've been quite a few times, and I had a tear in my eye, because it's like, this is not supposed to happen at this rate. It's really sad. So when you see photography, my daughter's 11, that's her age, 10 years. When you see that, it really resonates, and it's almost like the same image 10 years apart. That's a time frame that most people can understand, because it's a life experience they've experienced several times. And then we understand, okay, this is drastic. So I think actually when we go way back, that's like before we were born, okay, that's some history that we don't really need to deal with, and things were black and white, and people would smoke in hospitals and stuff, and it was like a different world. But when you go 10 years, okay, people had an iPhone back then, and I kind of understand what happened. It's a different, things resonate differently, I think. So if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does, yes. Frank McElhinney agrees with you in terms of raising awareness and reaching beyond that, where we need systemic change. The question being, are you aware of any photography projects that link climate change directly to systemic change? Apart from the campaigning work of Project Pressure, which I imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what we are doing is really, we are bridging art and science. So, the arts and the sciences used to be one. And we are linking up with, we do have an activism part. When you look at, let's say, I was creative directing the projection on the UN building, and then I've been in touch with other organizations, including Extinction Rebellion. I suggested to them, instead of sending protesters on some of the fossil fuels companies, because you'll violate all sorts of things. If you project, you could kind of start doing that. So they started working with projections. So it's kind of also, when you have a networked approach to a systemic issue, you can't say one project does everything. I think and this is kind of where I think we can help, is that Project Pressure is a little bit like the science arm and the communication arm of the environmental movement. That's what we do. And we're part of that movement, but we're not as a single unit, we don't do it. But I think when you look at art and art projects, if it sits in a network of other parties, then it becomes important. And I always used to say that people, when I introduced Project Pressure, I used to say, you have to think of Project Pressure as a networked activity. It's really about connecting the dots, and not just about communicating how the dots are connected, because that's one thing, but it's also about how that communication is disseminated. So, it's really like very systemic in its way that we think, and how we act and how we react and so on. So it's, what can you do with photography projects? I think you can definitely become part of that movement, and then it becomes very interesting.
Yeah, and I think what's implied in here is a kind of a restructuring or rethinking about how we relate to nature and how we live in cities. As a question comes through from Marjolaine Riley. and it's about instigating systemic change. Do we need radical shifts in our relationship to nature? And how can this happen? So many people live in cities, and do we need to redesign these? She does acknowledge that's a kind of big question that can't immediately be answered, but what's your response to that, Klaus?
Well, yeah, for sure. I can't remember when the person walked into a city and it became more than half of the world's population, but it's less than a decade ago, as far as I know. So yes, for sure. If nature has become for a lot of people something that is alien, and if you don't experience that, that's one thing to care about it. But I also think the media has a problem, and I would say, as much as I admire a lot of nature programs, they are part of the problem, because you look at these animals, you know, here's the lyre killing the gazelle, and it's fantastic slow motion and high definition cameras, but you don't have like 4 weeks of nothing happening because they're almost extinct.
Yeah,
you still have a prime time, and then there's a little bit of the end. Yeah, it was very difficult to film this because they're really rare, but part of the narrative around nature has to change, because it's not, nature doesn't exist orbiting humanity. It's like it's entwined. We can't, it's, if you mix gin into a gin and tonic, you can't just take the gin out. And that's the same way happening with humanity and nature. They're not two separate things. And first of all, we have to accept it, and then we have to act on it. And of course there's preservation, and there's, but I think it's really an old-fashioned mindset to think of the two as two different units, because but the two units have to but the two parts that I would argue they are the same unit now have to coexist. And that's the framework that we have to use on how we think around it. And then also, for sure, to your question, make people feel that they're part of this. But it's not that, yes, there's nature and I need to feel something around nature. We are nature. We're 70% water. We are part of this system. And we really need to connect that in a very strong way.